They say power makes people braver than they ought to be, and lonelier in ways they never imagined. Lucas Marshall believed both were useful currencies. If you stay until the end, subscribe and like. It will help stories like this find more eyes. The party unfurled like a polished film. Crystal catches of light, a string quartet muffled beneath laughter, a skyline of glass that made the city look obedient. Lucas moved through it the way a king moves across a board, composed, always calculating several moves ahead. Men in silk, women in measured smiles, servers moved as if rehearsed. At the edge of the terrace, a chess set sat on a marble table beneath a sculptural lamp, an affectation Jack had insisted upon. Jack liked props. He liked wagers even more. "You see her?" Jack said, nodding toward Khloe Richards across the room. She stood in a plain dress, an island of simple lines in a sea of designer labels. She was talking to someone, a charity director, Lucas noticed, and she listened like someone cataloged the world by need rather than image. Lucas watched the way she tilted her head when she listened. He liked that she did not lean toward spectacle. It made her harder to read. It made her a puzzle, which was precisely the draw. "Place?" Lucas asked, and Jack grinned, smelling the chance to set a game in motion. "Bet," Jack said, careless as a coin flipped into fate. "Make her say yes. Win the rarest thing, a genuine refusal surrendered." Lucas considered the bet as if it were a small acquisition, novel, difficult, enjoyable. He liked new challenges more than people. He agreed with a thin smile, not because he doubted his skill, but because the rules of these little competitions were always useful. They clarified focus, sharpened appetite. He did not think about the consequences beyond the table. He did not imagine a father who couldn't keep his store afloat, a mother who slept with her shoes on in case the landlord came, the small kitchen where arguments over electricity bills sounded like a jury passing sentence. Khloe accepted the glass he offered with a cool courtesy that unsettled him by its indifference. She did not laugh at his joke. She did not ask about his work. She asked about the charity she'd been speaking with, and then, with a directness that felt like a square placed against a corner, asked him what he intended to do with his life if not build towers that needed his name to feel solid. Lucas should have felt affront. Instead, he was amused. "I build things," he said, "structures people can count on." "You build on other people's fragility," she said. "That's easier than building for them." The remark lodged against him, an offhand dagger. He could have shrugged it off, turned the conversation into a game, and moved on. Instead, the suggestion turned territorial, as if a board had been set and a piece had been moved without his consent. He proposed, not bluntly, but with an economy that suggested inevitability, a contract. The bet then became a wager on a marriage of convenience. Lucas would marry Khloe, not because he desired her in the usual way, but because winning a calculated intimacy appealed to his appetite for control. She would accept the marriage on terms, her terms, if certain conditions were met. A fixed time, a public appearance, a legal agreement that ensured she stepped in with her own demands. It was cold, it was precise, and she, for reasons that were never fully explained at the moment, said yes. That first night in their shared suite felt less like a consummation than a truce. The penthouse stretched above the city like a glass fortress. Beyond the window, traffic lights blinked at intervals that had nothing to do with human pulse. Lucas watched the way the city looked smaller from up there, like a diorama that could be rearranged to taste. He enjoyed the view because it confirmed a belief. Distance made everything manageable. Khloe moved through his world like someone refusing to be dazzled by stagecraft. She made coffee in the morning and drank it black. When she laughed, it softened him in a way he had not expected, an offset to his hunger. But she also kept a file folder in her bag, worn at the edges, that she never left on show. The file had names, suppliers, small contractors, local proprietors whose livelihoods depended on a cascade of decisions Lucas's company made. She did not speak of them, but she moved with the awareness of someone who knew how policy and profit landed in a kitchen. Their marriage, at first, was a measured sequence of public appearances and private distances. Lucas paid attention to the public. He learned to keep his hands where cameras liked them. Khloe paid attention to what was neglected: unpaid invoices that clustered like small animals, late calls from a father who could not make payroll, a neighbor whose goodness was an exposed nerve. Behind the glint of the boardroom and brand photos, there were communities whose structures relied on margins too thin to show on quarterly reports. Khloe's family lived in that margin. He started to notice fractures the way one notices hairline cracks in an expensive vase. Small at first, then suddenly the whole thing becomes precarious. A development Lucas's firm greenlit in a Brooklyn block eclipsed a group of storefronts Khloe had mentioned months earlier. The company had promised to relocate tenants to fund improvements. The contract's language, read later in the cold light of a lawyer's eyes, favored demolition. Khloe raised her voice once, only once, at a meeting where Lucas signed approvals. She spoke of promises, of the people who had trusted numbers and signatures. He smiled at her, the way you smile at an opponent who pleads a case you have already countered. To him, the meeting was a line item. To her, it was a lifeline clipped. It would have ended there if the fallout had remained administrative. But life has a tendency to convert those abstract losses into bodies. Khloe's father, Samuel Richards, ran a small printing shop that had been in the family for 20 years. The shop had been their anchor, the texture of paper, the smell of ink, a morning routine that felt like continuity. When Samuel's contracts dried up after the development bid, he took on extra work at odd hours. He called Khloe less often, the words cramped against him like a hand pressed to a mouth. In one conversation, he tried to be stoic, saying that creditors were hungry but that he would work harder. Khloe heard an exhaustion she had not been taught to fix. The night Samuel closed the shop for the last time, the noises that came through the thin apartment walls were not dramatic. No shouting, no single catastrophic moment. They were smaller: the metallic scrape of a lock, a drawer slid and shut, the quiet folding of papers. In the weeks that followed, offers from agencies and agencies of men with bright suits and brighter promises came and went. Samuel refused many. He couldn't bear the idea of bargaining the dignity of the work he had held his whole life. Khloe started to leave food at the door in the evenings, polite in the way of someone who knows the line between help and invasion. He left notes that were brief and grateful. Then he was gone. Khloe did not tell Lucas at first. She moved through him in the apartment with a precision that made him feel, for the first time, unwelcome in his own home. When she did tell him, it was not the moment he expected, no cinematic reveal, but a freezing of the room. She spoke as if reading from a ledger. "My father isn't here anymore," she said. He couldn't keep going. He had imagined grief in the abstract and failed to recognize this, the specific gravity of someone ending themselves after the slow erosion of hope. She said the words and retreated to a silence that was not absent, but a fortified reserve. Lucas tasted guilt like metal. He had been culpable in the way a bureaucracy can be culpable, not by malice, but by the dominoes set in motion without ever looking back. He thought he could fix it with money. He learned, with a cold efficiency, that money rarely undoes the particular shape of a wound. He arranged settlements, a sum that would have kept Samuel's shop afloat for a time, charitable donations in his name, a trust for Khloe's mother. But the trust felt like a ledger entry, not a mending. Khloe accepted the checks with a manner practiced on the edge of courtesy and accusation. She did not forgive. She did not kiss him. She could and did withhold intimacy in a way that made his penthouse feel both cold and exposed. Then came the pregnancy, an event that altered the geometry of their fragile truce. Khloe told him in the kitchen over 2 chipped mugs. She placed one on the counter and watched him cradle the rim of his cup as if it were an artifact of a life he still had rights to. For a moment, something unaccountable loosened in him. He thought, this is how you tether an empire to a human heart. He wanted it, not as a game, not as a conquest, but with the rawness of someone whose scaffolds were failing and who wanted a real center. The child, for a while, rewrote their daily choreography. Lucas stopped insisting on being right in every meeting. He began to linger over details he had once deemed unimportant: the quality of the crib's wood, the angle of a light fixture that would not glare in late-night feedings, a quiet hum of domestic practicality he had never noticed existed. Khloe watched him. She noticed the change, but kept her defenses rounded and slow. The delivery was an emergency, the kind that compresses time and scrambles rehearsed protocols into improvisation. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Machines hummed with a steady impartiality. Staff moved with the trained velocity of people used to choreographing trauma. When the doctors said the words that would undo plans, "The baby is not breathing," the room narrowed to the raw texture of pain. They did what hospitals do. They called time, they moved, they attempted access the way trained people do in the face of failing systems. Lucas's instinct in those moments was not strategic. It was a primitive, guttural refusal to accept that something he could not command should be taken away from them. The nurse, a woman whose face had the tired righteousness of caretakers, tried to escort the child away under the hospital's customary protocol for stillbirths and neonatal care. There are rules, clinical, legal, that govern what happens when a child is born dead. They are precise and cold in a way intended to protect, to reduce harm, to spare infection and confusion in paperwork. Lucas saw Khloe's face hollow, the shutness of it, and did something he had never done before. He broke the rule. He took the baby into his arms, against the nurse's gentle hold, and held him close. The child's skin was not warm, but his body had weight. Lucas felt the weight like an indictment and a benediction at once. The nurse hesitated, then led him, and a hospital hummed around them like an immovable city permitting an act of defiance. Staff later called it compassion, bureaucratically incorrect but humane. For Lucas, the moment was a crack opening in him so wide that light and disgrace both fell through. Khloe let him hold the child. She placed her hand on his chest and did not look at the window. She let the city be a backdrop, and the room a small private geography of sorrow. There, in the hush, words that would have been expert in other settings, names of conditions, options, meant nothing. What mattered was their permission to kneel with loss, not to bureaucratize it. Lucas's violation of policy, whispered about in hospital corridors afterwards, released a kind of furious attention in him he had never possessed, shame at his company's role in Samuel's collapse, and a fierce animal desire to repair what he had helped break. Khloe let him hold the child. She placed her hand on his chest and did not look at the window. She let the city be a backdrop, and the room a small private geography of sorrow. There, in the hush, words that would have been expert in other settings, names of conditions, options, meant nothing. What mattered was their permission to kneel with loss, not to bureaucratize it. Lucas's violation of policy, whispered about in hospital corridors afterwards, released a kind of furious attention in him he had never possessed, shame at his company's role in Samuel's collapse, and a fierce animal desire to repair what he had helped break. The fallout outside the hospital was public and clinical and very, very human. Headlines that had once fawned over his acquisitions now drew the outline of consequence. His board called him in. Clients asked for clarifications. There were legal reviews and boardroom faces that did not look like friends. Jack, who had liked the idea of the bet as a thought experiment, now looked away when Lucas passed. The world that had once been a diorama of chosen distance began to constrict. Khloe's revelation to the press, delivered months after the funeral, precise and unbearable, folded the narrative into a new shape. In a speech she gave, voice steady like glass, she said, "My son was born dead." The words carried. She outlined, without rancor but without evasion, how the fracture of her father's livelihood had seeped into a household already knotted with worry. She described grief and the particulars of steady erosion. She accused not with theatrics but with facts. The accusation was not only at Lucas's company, but at a pattern. Decisions made where the human costs blurred into line items. What happened next was not instantaneous morality. Policies do not crumble because one man feels contrition. But people see, and pressure moves in its own slow ecology. Backlash arrived. Protesters at a development site, articles in respected journals about the human cost of rapid urban renewal, a contractor refusing to work on one of Lucas's projects citing ethical concerns. His company's stock trembled. Clients demanded change. The board convened, and that meeting, sharp, bright, and merciless, began with a ledger and ended with a question of stewardship. Lucas's first action was symbolic and also practical. He resigned his lead on the block project, citing a need to oversee an independent audit and to make amends to those harmed. The press called it damage control. The small families he had hurt called it overdue. He established a restitution fund in Samuel's name, with scholarships and emergency grants for affected businesses. He insisted that the board allocate not a PR sum, but a multi-year program with measurable goals. Job protection clauses, guaranteed relocation assistance, mental health resources for displaced workers. He sat in rooms where men argued numbers and women argued for dignity, and he listened. Repair, he discovered, was granular. It was a scheduled visit to a printing press where the coffee was bad and the floor had a grit that never left your shoes. It was a check handed in private. It was sitting in a cramped kitchen and letting an embarrassed neighbor tell you stories about the way the light used to slant into their storefront in the afternoon. It was listening when people said they did not want pity, they wanted a chance. It was not the headline. It was the restoration of a supplier contract at fair rates and the cancellation of a meeting that, for Lucas, had once meant holding power in his palm. Khloe watched his work like someone watching an unfamiliar dialect. She let small things happen. A bouquet of peonies left at the doorway on a morning when the apartment smelled of rain, an unannounced cup of tea at noon that felt like an intrusion of civility. She did not let the gestures settle into forgiveness. Instead, they built a ledger of their own, small, patient, refusing to be proof of love, but allowing the possibility of trust to grow thin roots again. But even as he built outward, Lucas had to rebuild inward. He joined grief counseling and read books about the psychology of harm, not as a checkbox, but because the phrases helped him understand habitual alibis. Once, in a small group, an old woman told him, "The work you did can never become the work you refused to do before." It was not a sentence that annulled his efforts. It was a sentence that required a new orientation. He began to take the long view. Weeks accumulated into months. Some people accepted the help and moved on. Others refused it with a dignity that cut. Khloe's mother visited the apartment once and left a loaf of bread on the counter. She did not look at him in the way she used to look at landlords or lawyers. She looked at him like someone measuring whether a bridge would hold a child crossing. The company changed under the weight of these events. Policies regarding displacement were rewritten, less spectacle, more clauses that actually protected livelihoods. Lucas, who had once liked the shape of a deal because it fit his name on paper, began to imagine structures that bore human weight. He did not make grand speeches, he changed clauses. The public watched the slow, bureaucratic cogs and decided what they would say. Some called him sincere, others called him calculating. He did not spend energy arguing with those voices. He spent time in places where he had not before. After-hour meetings with small business owners, classes on management that taught listening rather than ordering, a clinic in a neighborhood whose maternity services had once been a line item in his philanthropic portfolio and now received discreet oversight and funding. He visited hospitals and asked questions about bereavement protocols, how many minutes a family was allowed with a stillborn infant, what the policies were for memory making, for holding. It was not theater. It was, he hoped, practical repair for a kind of institutional coldness he had helped normalize. Khloe watched these acts at a distance. Sometimes she let a softened look cross her face when she saw a peony placed in a vase on a table where children's artwork now hung.
Sometimes she canceled a meeting to spend a morning at a clinic Lucas had funded, observing from the doorway as staff read the new guidance on family-centered grief care. She told herself forgiveness required time and evidence. The months that followed were not linear. There were days when the phone would ring and she would not answer.
There were nights when Lucas would sit in the dark and write lists of reparative acts and check them off like liturgy. The thaw came not as a grand unfreezing, but as small thaws. A cup of tea accepted without caution. A chessboard set up on a Sunday evening on the kitchen table. A hand that reached out for another's and did not recoil. They rebuilt rituals, not because that made everything right, but because rituals taught them new neural pathways, how to be habitual in kindness instead of habitual in acquisition. Peonies appeared on the anniversaries of loss and were left again on the kitchen table as a small daily promise. When Khloe became pregnant again months later, the news did not sweep the room into bliss. They both knew that hope was not a guarantee. It was an invitation back into the world of risk. The pregnancy this time carried the softest tread. Extra appointments, a fetal heartbeat heard with a quiet joy that had no entitlement. A pattern of gentleness developed in the months of repair. They walked slowly through the city at night sometimes, past lit windows that looked like small altars of ordinary life. Lucas learned to notice the warmth of the apartment when Khloe boiled water for tea, the way steam blurred the window and made the skyline less like a diorama and more like a living, breathing place. No narrative of redemption here was simple. People who had lost businesses and dignity did not forget quickly. Not all trust returned. Some friendships dissolved without reconciliation. But in the private geometry of the couple's life, foundations shifted. Lucas learned that restitution could not be an annual press release. It had to be a pattern. Monthly visits, scholarships renewed, hiring policies adjusted. He took a step back from the sharp edge of the company and agreed to a role that allowed him to oversee the human impact projects he had helped institute. It was a smaller title, but it kept him close to the work that mattered. The day Khloe went into labor the second time, Lucas felt a kind of reconsecration of his priorities. The delivery was careful this time, the slow, attentive kind practiced in hospitals that had learned from mistakes and incorporated compassion into their protocols. The nurses moved as professionals who had been taught to give space and also to hold. When the baby was born alive and breathed, the small room filled with sound in a way Lucas had feared he would never hear again. The infant's cry was a punctuation mark after a long and complicated sentence. Khloe's tears were not for the public, they were for the private work of letting herself hope. They married a year later, not because law made love legitimate, but because they chose together to commit in a way that honored what had been broken and what had been repaired. The ceremony was small. Peonies in simple vases, a banquet table with strong coffee and tea set out like an offering to ordinary joys. A chessboard placed at the corner of the room as a reminder that some games should not be played with people. They danced slowly, the city a softened light behind them, and for one quiet instant Lucas felt the full weight of what he could not buy. Trust rebuilt by the labor of contrition. In the months that followed, the hospital where he had once broken the rules to hold a lifeless child adopted new bereavement guidelines that allowed families more agency. The policy changes were not miracles, they were the product of pressure, of partnerships with charities, and of the stark human testimony Khloe had given. Staff trained on listening as much as technique. The changes were a small industry of better practices that replicated quietly in other hospitals, a cautious ripple. People debated at length whether what he had done in the delivery room broke every medical rule or simply revealed how brittle some rules were when they failed to account for dignity. The truth sat between those takes. He had broken protocol. Hospital administrators had called it a moral choice and then turned that moral choice into policy. Nothing magical happened, no supernatural revival. What did happen was the conversion of one man's guilt into sustained action,
and the willingness of others to let him act in service rather than in spectacle. Not everything healed. There were anniversaries when ghosts returned. There were nights when Khloe would wake and find Lucas awake as well, and the two would sit at the window and talk about nothing until the city muffled them with its distant traffic. Those conversations became the scaffolding of a life neither of them could have planned the night they agreed to a cold contract. They found, in ordinary domesticity, tea on rainy mornings, chess moves made and forgiven, peonies arriving like small second chances, that love could be patient without being naive. When they told the story later, because stories asked to be told and people listened, it was never as a sermon. It was a record of how a man who had once treated the world as a board to be mastered learned instead that some losses cannot be rebalanced with capital alone. It was about small acts that compound: visits to a shuttered shop, scholarships, policy changes, a cup of tea held in silence. It was about a woman who refused to be a prize and instead insisted upon justice and dignity before tenderness. There were nights when Lucas would look at the chessboard by the window and see pawns that were once people, and he would think of the city's light like a network of small lamps, each one needing attention. He learned in the slow hush of years that building a structure people could count on meant first counting the people under its shadow.
And once, at the kitchen table, Khloe placed a peony in a jar and said simply, "We did this badly, and then we tried to do it better." Lucas reached for her hand, and this time the reach was not a claim, but an offering. The wound of the child they lost never fully closed. It remained a place in their house, a picture on a shelf, a folded blanket kept in a drawer, an ache that taught them how to hold tenderness without owning it. The child they later raised filled days with ordinary noise, a crooked smile, questions about how the city worked, a preference for tea with too much sugar. Those ordinary things became their redemption, quiet, stubborn, human acts repeated until they altered the shape of a life. Outside, policy shifted in small increments. Families were given more time with their babies who did not survive. Hospitals built spaces that recognized grief as work, not pathology. Those shifts were not the product of a single man, but of a community that refused to accept numbness as the default. Lucas's name was never erased from the story, nor should it have been. He had broken rules and then spent years making restitution so that the ruptures his ambition had helped cause would be addressed in structural ways. On the last clear night described in this account, the three of them, Khloe, Lucas, and their child, stood by the penthouse window. The skyline had become a witness, not a stage. Peonies sat on the sill, a cup of tea steamed on a saucer, and the chessboard waited for a game that felt no longer like conquest. They watched the city breathe. Lucas did not feel like a king. He felt like a man who had learned, with work and with sorrow, how to be present. If you were moved by Khloe's decision to forgive and by Lucas's slow rebuilding, leave a comment below about what forgiveness looks like to you, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this story. Your thoughts matter. Dawn came to the city in a slow gray unwrapping, a light that hesitated over rooftops and then, as if convinced, slid down the glass of the penthouse. Khloe made coffee while the child climbed into her lap with a book about rivers. Lucas stood by the window for a long time, hands folded, watching the day begin to take its ordinary work. There was no triumph in the air, only the steady, patient business of living. He liked that. It felt more durable than any headline, more honest than any apology. The momentum of change, however, kept its own calendar. Meetings that had once been predictably hostile now opened with minutes of silence. Administrators who had once called the delivery room incident an unfortunate deviation now asked for Lucas's counsel about bereavement spaces, about training modules that would teach presence alongside procedure. He found himself drafting language that could not be reduced to slogans. Clauses about time, about consent, about how grief ought to be held in medicine. Khloe attended those meetings too, though less frequently. Her work had adjusted, not vanished. She taught, she wrote, She met with mothers who wanted to be heard more than they wanted to be fixed. People sought her without fanfare. A text that said, "Only wanted to say thank you," stood at the other end of grief this year. Sometimes she answered immediately, sometimes she didn't. She have learned to let space be its own mercy. One afternoon, a case arrived at the hospital that felt like the test everyone had been waiting for. A young couple, midwives called in from a birth center because fetal demise had been suspected. The husband paced the length of the corridor like a man trying to empty himself of motion. The wife's sister held her hand, fingers tight as belief. The attending on duty was a doctor who had once written an op-ed criticizing Lucas. She had the crisp tone of someone who believed rules were the best scalpel for messy ethics. When the diagnosis was confirmed, no heartbeat, no future for the child, protocol prescribed a set of next steps: paperwork, a short regulated interval for family time, and efficient release into grief counseling. The doctor read the checklist, her voice even, as if each box closed a circuit. The husband asked, quietly, if they could hold their baby longer than the 30 minutes the policy suggested. He had spent nights imagining what holding might feel like, and had woken with the ache of not having tried. It was one of those frail, decisive requests that tests institutional kindness. Lucas arrived for unrelated consultation and was slowly briefed in the doorway. He listened to the family, to the doctor's careful explanations, to the nurse who labored under exhaustion and compassion both. In the small room where the family waited, the husband's plea arrived again, more urgent now. Could they keep the baby at the bedside for a few hours? Could someone bring them warm blankets, a cup of tea, a place to sleep? The research suggested little harm. The old fears of complication were more performative than clinical. Yet what gnawed at Lucas was not data, it was memory, of the one time when rules had been allowed to outrun humanity, and of the ways his own actions had fractured faith in the system. He sat down with the couple and spoke plainly. "We can make this right," he said, "not by fixing what was lost, that cannot be fixed, but by making sure you have what you need." He turned then to the doctor. "You created this policy," she said later, partly flinching, partly defending, "and you'll defend it." He did not defend every single clause. He argued for an amendment on the spot. Extend bedside time when requested by the family, with proper support from the team. His voice was low and steady, the kind that had once commanded operating rooms and capital campaigns. Now it moved with a thinner, more precise power. The doctor hesitated. The hospital's lawyers hesitated in absentia, as if legal caution had a way of leaning across the shoulders of professionals the way an elbow leans on a table. But compassion, once given a place to stand, was a persuasive thing. The couple held their baby for 3 hours. A nurse brought a cup of mint tea that had been a ritual in her own family. Someone slipped a peony stem into a mason jar and set it on the bedside table. The husband rested his head against the paper-draped bed and cried in staccato breaths. The sister sang once, a song you could have mistaken for nonsense if you did not know how grief invents meaning. Afterward, the family thanked everyone in a way that made no claim about absolution, only gratitude for being allowed to refuse haste. The story traveled through the hospital like a small, steady rumor of goodness. Months later, at a monthly policy review, the amendment passed with minor revisions. It was not a revolution. It was a procedural change that required forms and signatures, training sessions, and awkward slide decks. Yet it mattered. Families were now permitted time, and teams were resourced to sit with them. Lucas sat at the table, his fingers folded, feeling less like a man who had stolen a moment and more like someone who had helped build a doorway. There were still critics. Some said the changes burdened staff. Some argued that the exception would become the rule and that the rule, once generalized, would become useless. The debate was healthy in its way. An institution talking about itself is almost always better than an institution pretending not to need change. Lucas learned to defend the amendment not with moralizing rhetoric, but with case notes and testimonials. He let the parents who had benefited speak at meetings, and their words had a blunt force that statistics did not. Back at home, they cultivated a life that could hold both the ache and the small satisfactions.
Their child learned to order tea too sweet and to manipulate the knight on the chessboard in ways that delighted both parents. Khloe would sometimes catch Lucas watching the child and see as much reverence in his gaze as in any valedictory speech he had once given. He had learned rituals of presence, a hand on a shoulder at the end of a hard day, a quiet admission of error when it felt right, the willingness to be interrupted by small domestic needs. Where before he had measured success by output and accolades, he now found himself measuring by constancy. Did he come when he said he would? Did he listen without interruption? Did he apologize even when the apology did not change the past? Once, at a community forum, a woman stood to speak about the night her baby had been stillborn, and how a nurse had wrapped her arms around her without words. She said the nurse's touch had been the first thing to tell her she was not alone. The room held its breath. The letter became a talisman for them, the proof that small acts travel further than one expects. They pinned it to the corkboard in the kitchen, near an index card that said, "We do this badly, and then we try to do it better." Evenings returned to a gentle rhythm. Chess games were played without grand strategies, tea cooled on saucers while the child practiced reading aloud. There were bills and doctor appointments and other duties that felt mundane and grounding. And yet, beneath the ordinary, a quieter work continued. Repairs to policy, repairs to relationships, the reweaving of trust. One morning, a message arrived asking if Lucas would testify before a regional health board considering statewide standards. The request was formal and impersonal. Khloe read it and looked at him. "Do you want to go?" she asked. He considered the question as if it were a choice between two paths equally demanding. "I think I need to," he said finally. "Not to tell them what they must do, but to tell them what we learned when we listened." He prepared his testimony with a discipline that was no longer showmanship but stewardship. He practiced nothing of the rhetorical flourishes that once had been his trademark. Instead, he rehearsed small truths and family stories, anonymized of course, about the ways time and presence had altered outcomes of grief. He asked Khloe to read over his remarks. She suggested removing phrases that sounded boastful and inserting acknowledgments of those who had done the quiet work. He obeyed. When he spoke at the board, he did not ask for applause. He asked only for policy that favored humanity. Afterward, on the drive home, Khloe reached for his hand across the console. "If they listen," she said, "it will be because you learned how to grieve without losing sight of people." Lucas squeezed her fingers back. He thought of the initial fracture and of the long years it had taken to make amends. There was no tidy closure to offer, not in life, not in policy. But there were fewer ghosts in the house, there were more people at the bedside. And somewhere beneath the city's luminous grid, other lamps continued to be tended by hands that had learned to linger. The hospital asked for a small thing. Would Lucas and Khloe come to the unit on the anniversary of the changes, to say a few words and to stand as witnesses to a policy that had been carved out of quiet grief? They sent the invitation in one of those corporate emails that tried to sound tender and failed. Too many clauses, too much neatness. But the care team who had worked beside them called personally and asked as if they were asking a neighbor to tea. Lucas and Khloe agreed. On the morning of the commemoration, snow had loosened into slush, but the light was clean and honest. The unit smelled of coffee and antiseptic and fresh paper, small, ordinary certainties. Nurses pinned blue ribbons to their scrubs. There was no podium, only a row of chairs and a wall where, months before, someone had tacked the first memory card, a child's scrawl, a pressed leaf, the Booties photo. The card still hung there, edges softened by other hands. The clinician Lucas had mentored stood by the door. He was younger than Lucas had been at his bravest. There were still bits of swagger, too much confidence in his jaw, but the eyes were different, open in a way that made Lucas think of someone who had been taught to wait at the doorway rather than rush straight in. He spoke first, awkwardly, of checklists and hours spent at bedsides. He thanked the families who had become teachers, and then he thanked Lucas in a way that had nothing performative, a look that meant he had listened and had been changed. Families came forward.
A woman spoke of a nurse who had sat with her, unafraid of silence. A father spoke of being allowed to hold his daughter twice, both times with hands that trembled but did not flinch. Their words were small and precise. There were no grand arcs, only fragments of goodness. When Khloe took the microphone, she did not offer platitudes either. She read the line pinned to their corkboard: "We do this badly, and then we try to do it better." Laughter, not sharp but wet with relief, moved through the room. Afterward, as people shuffled toward the coffee urn and pastry platters, a woman came to the board and touched the Booties photograph with a fingertip that trembled more from age than from grief. She held out a small knotted bundle. Lucas recognized the yarn of the Booties at once when she unfolded it, not because it had anything unique, but because it matched the way some tiny stitches had been made, a left-handed twist that only someone who had worked with that yarn would reproduce. "I sent the note," she said. Her voice was threadbare in the kindest way. "I have been carrying them for years." She did not look for acceptance or absolution. She looked instead as if she had finally placed something on the table. Khloe took the bundle and passed it to Lucas. He felt the tiny hollow of the booty in his palm, and, absurdly, remembered how cold his fingers had been the night he had failed. The woman told them, briefly, without drama, that she had lost a child in another hospital long ago, that at the time the rules had been colder, and grief, for her, had been a room with no chairs. When she had read about the memory rooms and the slow changes, she had wanted to offer what she could: a small pair of booties she had kept in a drawer, and a thank you for people who would hold a child even when it was the hardest thing to do. "You let me keep holding him," she said, and the pronoun belonged to a whole generation of tender acts. She did not ask for forgiveness. There was nothing to grant. She simply said the truth of what carrying a thing does to a person. In that moment, Lucas understood, with his whole precarious body, that the work they had done went both ways. Professionals who learned to linger were remade by the families who taught them how. Outside, the city had the softened jitter of an afternoon recovering from snow. Lucas and Khloe walked to their car with the booties wrapped in tissue like a small relic. Their child clambered into the backseat, still excited by the pastries, and Khloe hummed a melody while Lucas drove. The rhythm of the street felt ordinary and therefore astonishing. A bus hissed, someone argued about sports on a stoop, a dog leapt at a puddle and won. At home, the booties went into a shallow wooden box with the other tokens, an odd collection that resembled a seaside of keepsakes. Lucas took his place at the chessboard that evening, not to reconstruct strategy, but to sit with the family and be present in the unremarkable art of making small moves. The game stalled at a benign impasse. The child fell asleep with a picture book splayed open across her face. Khloe stood by the window and looked at the streetlights. "We keep them lit," she said softly. "That's all we can do." In the weeks that followed, Lucas found his presence migrating beyond the unit. He began to take part in training sessions, not as an expert with answers, but as a man who could tell the truth of missteps and the long, uneven work after. He sat in a circle of clinicians and read aloud a line that had not been his original plan. "If you must be brave at the bedside." People wrote that down. There were setbacks, of course. An old committee fought over funding and phrasing. A clinician relapsed into defensive language when a grieving father accused her of neglect. Lucas learned to expect friction and to treat it as a stubborn but ordinary weather. He found himself returning, sometimes, to the shelf with the folded blanket. He pressed his fingers into the weave and allowed memory to be a companion rather than an accusation. One evening, months after the anniversary, a woman came to their door. She had read the hospital newsletter and somehow found their address. She was neither seeking praise nor closure, only to say thank you. "You let me hold his hand," she said, and in that sentence, a whole architecture of meaning collapsed and reassembled into something simpler: that small acts could be seats of dignity. They sat together in the kitchen. Tea cooled. The child played with a wooden horse on the floor.
The woman told a story about how, in the dull hours after loss, she had found a neighbor who brought soup and did not ask for her story. Presence, she said, is not an answer. It is company. Lucas heard in her voice the echoes of his own failures and a surprising grace that forgiveness does not always call itself such. Sometimes it arrives as a neighbor who will sit. Outside, the city hummed under a careful watch. Lamps were tended by hands that had learned to linger.
Policies could be written and revised, committees convened, and reports filed. But the true work, Lucas thought this often now, was not a document. It was the mundane discipline of being there when the room was full of shadows. It was the patience to listen to an anxious clinician, the courage to sit in silence with a family, the willingness to be remade by their stories. On nights when the dreams returned, when chess pieces were phantom cold beneath his palms, Lucas no longer kept his sorrows strictly to himself. He talked to Khloe, to friends, to the clinicians who had also been broken. He learned that mending a life often meant admitting seams and asking for help to stitch them. He learned that memory, kept gently, did not immobilize, it propelled. It reached out in small threads, connecting a nurse in a hallway with a parent in a ward, a volunteer with a pair of booties, and a man who had once trusted his confidence more than his care. And somewhere under the grid of the city, hands moved in low light. Lamps were not always steady, but they were tended. The work continued, not as a triumph, but as a promise, that people could learn to keep holding one another, one difficult, ordinary hour at a time.